Okay, well, while I'm waiting for my slide to come up, I shall start. I should like to thank COLIBEX for inviting me to give a presentation at the conference. In this presentation, I will show how my measurement instruments of both de jure and de facto academic freedom have developed over time. The systems of measurement I shall demonstrate were used to examine the legal and normative protection for academic freedom in the European nations. But these measurement instruments could readily be used to analyse the situation in other nations, such as Canada. I have 20 minutes for my presentation, so I will go through the slides quickly, but I've already made them available to the people here, and so if you want a copy, I will give it to you. The first point we can make is, one moment. Aha. The first point we can make is that there is no commonly agreed definition of academic freedom. However, the 1997 UNESCO recommendation on the status of higher education teaching personnel is probably the most widely accepted. The recommendation is not a standalone document, but is derived from other international regulations, such as, for example, the 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 1966 UN International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. However, many nations differ from the recommendation in how they recognize and protect academic freedom. For example, the USA did not sign the 1997 UNESCO recommendation, as President Ronald Reagan took the US out of UNESCO in 1984, and it did not rejoin until October 2003. The lack of a clear definition has meant that academic freedom is a contested concept, more especially in the United States, where it is protected only indirectly under Supreme Court interpretations of the First Amendment on freedom of speech. As this slide shows, academic freedom can be considered to have substantive and supportive elements. The substantive elements of academic freedom are the freedom to research and the freedom to teach. These are recognized in most nations with minor reservations. For example, in Austria, the freedom to research includes the right not to undertake research on a particular topic on the grounds of individual conscience. The supportive elements of academic freedom are autonomy, both individual and institutional, shared governance, and tenure. These supporting elements acting in unison are necessary for academic freedom, but each in its own right is insufficient for academic freedom to flourish. Hence, single elements are less individually important than the fact that they mesh together. Thus, where one of the mutually supportive elements falters, it undermines the other two, thereby weakening substantive academic freedom for both research and teaching. For example, if tenure is lacking, then academics may not be able to enjoy autonomy or participate in shared governance and make decisions on, for example, university research priorities or subject teaching methods, because staff are worried that if they do speak out, they will lose their jobs. This slide shows the activities most commonly associated with freedom to teach. However, the extent to which these freedoms can be enjoyed will vary from nation to nation, from university to university, and even from one university department to another. For example, in the United Kingdom, the Higher Education Act 2004 states that it is universities acting as corporate entities rather than the individual teaching staff that have the freedom to determine the contents of courses and the manner in which they are taught, supervised or assessed. So, in the United Kingdom, academic freedom for teaching by individual staff is subservient to the university's corporate control. This slide shows activities most commonly associated with freedom to research. However, as with the freedom to teach, the extent to which these freedoms can be enjoyed varies between nations, universities, and subject departments. For example, the Constitution of Greece forbids academics from publishing research on the size and capability of Greece's army, navy, and air forces. In Denmark, the 2011 university law states that universities are responsible for protecting and upholding research freedom and the ethics of each individual academic and of the university itself. However, the same law says that topics being researched by staff need to fall within the university's research profile. So, under the law, university managers can allocate institutional research tasks to academics, who can only start to undertake their individual preferred research topics after they have met these institutional research commitments. Work I undertook in 2007 examined the extent to which national legislation and constitutional protection was in full compliance, qualified compliance, or non-compliance with 4 elements of the 1997 UNESCO recommendation, which were academic freedom, institutional autonomy, university self-governance, and tenure. This method was chosen in recognition of the variation between states. For example, in some countries like Spain, tenure is offered following some form of competition and may be subject to periodic review. Hence, Spanish universities can be said to be in qualified compliance rather than absolute compliance with the UNESCO recommendation. Similarly, in Finland, in terms of governance, the academic staff are not in the majority on the University Management Board, but all members of the University Management Board are appointed by the University Senate, which suggests qualified compliance with the UNESCO recommendation rather than full compliance. This table summarizes the protection for academic freedom in the European states in both national constitutions and legal instruments. Tables such as this were used for a more detailed analysis and enabled the development of a more sophisticated measure. The data from the previous table was used to show whether EU nations and the UK are in full compliance, qualified compliance, or non-compliance with respect to the 4 measures of the UNESCO 1997 recommendation in respect to academic freedom, academic tenure, legal autonomy, and university self-governance. As we can see from this table, only 7 nations are in full compliance with every measure. By contrast, Denmark is not in full compliance with any of the 4 UNESCO elements. The reporting of my research in the Danish press led to ministerial questions in the Danish Parliament, followed by an appeal to UNESCO by the Danish Professional Association of Academics, and a subsequent change in the Danish national law on academic freedom. This initial top-down analysis of de jure protection for academic freedom generated a significant impact and was widely cited. However, it failed to include compliance with international agreements and did not look in detail at each nation state. Funding from the European Union for a Marie Curie intra-European fellow provided the resources to gather more data in order to extend the scope, detail, and accuracy of this initial top-down analysis. A scorecard was developed which used 37 different questions to assess the legal protection for academic freedom in 5 areas: freedom to teach and to research, institutional autonomy, university self-governance, employment protection via tenure, and also international agreements in the Constitution. Each of the 5 elements was scored out of 20 points, and then the scores for each element were added up to give a composite overall score out of 100. This slide shows the 37 measures that were used to measure de jure protection for academic freedom. For example, measures 21 and 22 look at the ability of the academic staff to appoint and dismiss the rector. Measures 23 through 27 deal with the awarding and removal of tenure. Using these 37 scorecard questions, a total of 1,073 different observations were gathered from the 27 EU states and from the UK and Norway. Gathering and assessing this de jure data was very difficult and time-consuming. This slide gives an example of how 5 measures deal... Make sure I'm on the right one. Yes.
You've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay. Dealing with international agreements were scored, focusing on, first, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 3 points. Secondly, the optional protocol to that in International Covenant, 3 points. The International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, 3 points. The optional protocol to that covenant. And then finally, the European Convention on Human Rights. For each of the 4 international covenants, we used a 2-point scale. No marks were awarded for failure to ratify the covenants, while 3 marks were awarded for ratification. This slide shows the results for international agreements. Compliance with international agreements protecting academic freedom is generally high among the EU nation states. The mean was 5.5 out of 20. Looking at the freedom for teaching and research, on the basis of the data in this table, we can see that the legal protection for academic freedom across the EU nations for teaching and research is not high. The mean was only 11.8. Moreover, there's considerable variation. So, for example, some nations like Croatia score a maximum 20 points, whereas Malta and Estonia scored 0. This table shows the results for autonomy. And we can see that the legal protection for academic freedom for institutional autonomy across the EU states is generally low, scoring an average of 9.3. In this table, we have the results for university self-governance, and we can see the legal protection for academic freedom in respect to university self-governance across the EU states is generally very low. The mean is only 8.4. This is the table for job security, tenure, and it shows the legal protection for tenure is generally very low. Again, there's considerable variation across the EU states. Greece scores very high, whereas Estonia only scores 1.5. This table shows the summary of all the elements with scores out of 100. On the basis of the data in this table, we can see that firstly, the mean overall score is only just above 50. Secondly, there is a large variation between the EU states. The highest ranked nation is Croatia with 69 points, and the lowest is Estonia with a score of only 34. Using this summary table, we can compare the scores for the different elements. So we can see that the highest mean score is in relation to international agreements. National governments are willing to sign international agreements protecting academic freedom, but these agreements may be ignored in the day-to-day running of university departments. The lowest score is for tenure, with a mean of 7.7. Tenure is in retreat in most universities across Europe as new public management techniques are introduced. Indeed, job security for academics is in decline across the globe as universities succumb to the marketization of higher education. In summary, this presentation has demonstrated that in the EU states, de jure protection for academic freedom exists in constitutions and in legal instruments. However, the level of protection is generally low, with a mean of 52.9 out of 100, and there is considerable variation between different measures and nations. Moreover, it is possible for academics to be granted de jure protection for academic freedom, but for such freedom to be negated by the realities of normative de facto academic freedom, as experienced by academic staff undertaking their teaching and learning duties in university departments. Hence, although the impact of legal instruments is important, it needs to be balanced with empirical studies of the actual operation of academic freedom. So, having measured de jure protection for academic freedom, my colleagues and I then created a survey to measure the levels of de facto normative academic freedom. To gather empirical data on academic freedom, we created an online survey with versions in English, French, and Spanish. We posted letters to the rectors of every university in Europe, asking them to forward the online link for the survey to their staff with a request to complete it. Additionally, Education International, a global federation of teachers' trade unions to which most EU staffs associations belong, sent a letter to the heads of each of these associations explaining the survey's purpose, providing the online link for the survey, and asking for emails to be sent to all individual members of their associations with a request to complete the survey. This slide shows the first page of the survey. As can be seen, for the first question, respondents are requested to write in a text box what academic freedom means to them. The responses revealed there was no uniform opinion of academic freedom, and that many staff had no clear idea of what academic freedom is. Question 3 on this slide requires respondents to use a 9-point Likert scale to show the extent to which they believe academic freedom is protected in their department. This slide shows some of the questions relating to the institutional protection for academic freedom. As can be seen, the questions use a standard 5-point Likert scale. To make the survey easy to complete, most of the questions just required respondents to tick a box. However, for some of the more complex topics, respondents were asked follow-up questions requiring them to justify their responses by means of writing in a text box. Over 4,600 academics completed the survey online, and the resultant data set was analysed by the means of SPSS. The following slides summarise some of the important findings of the analysis in relation to attacks on academic freedom. This slide shows over 50% of survey respondents had no knowledge of the legal and constitutional protection for academic freedom in their nation. This table shows that respondents were more likely to say that protection for academic freedom in their university had decreased, 44.7, as opposed to increased, only 5.6. We can see from this table that 16.3% of the respondents, 1 person in 6 in other words, reported being subjected to psychological pressure by other staff within their university department because of their academic views. We can see from this table 15.5% of respondents to the survey reported being bullied by their academic colleagues because of their academic views. When we look at self-censorship, the statistics in the table show that rather than face being bullied or subjected to psychological pressure, a large proportion of staff, more than 1 person in 5, exercised self-censorship and did not speak out. This slide summarises some of the important findings of the analysis. The findings show that much needs to be done to educate university staff on their rights to academic freedom. If staff have greater knowledge of their academic freedom rights, then they are more likely to try and protect them. However, regrettably, it is one of the paradoxes of academia that, while universities provide training and development for every other profession, there is a reluctance for academics to recognise the need for training for themselves. I hope that my presentation has demonstrated it will be relatively easy to use the measurement instruments we have created to measure de jure and de facto academic freedom in Canada. My research has been used by academic professional associations in both the UK and Denmark to appeal to UNESCO that academic freedom is not sufficiently protected. In the case of Denmark, the national government set up an international evaluation committee which recommended changes in the law which were carried out. This slide shows some of my recent publications about academic freedom. If you want further information on the techniques used to measure de jure and de facto academic freedom, or copies of these papers, please contact me at the email address below. I should like to conclude by posing a question to you all. If we, as academics, allow our freedoms to be eroded so readily, what example are we passing on to those whom we teach? Thank you.